Anna here, NHCSR. It is wintertime. We are planning our field season, trying to decide where to direct our efforts this summer. And I'm learning about tomato. I'm going to admit I'm kind of scared. Tomato is a varsity level crop as far as I'm concerned. They're very hungry from a nutritional point of view. They have a lot of funny diseases, a lot of funny physiological disorders. So I'm talking to as many people as I can about this, talking to some experts, including the conversation I had today with Dr. Greg Vogel. I am fascinated with his work, and it sounds like we also found a little project to work on, maybe. So stay tuned for a little trial proposal with Greg and one of my colleagues here at University of New Hampshire. That will be very exciting. And here you go.
My name is Greg Vogel. I'm an assistant professor of plant breeding and genetics at Cornell University, and I work on breeding and researching tomato and eggplant.
Well, we joke that like growing in a high tunnel is kind of like growing outside, and it's kind of like growing inside, but it's nothing like growing outside, and it's nothing like growing. Like it's like it
Yeah.
is a really unique thing. And so going forward into your research program here at Cornell, I mean, is that unique environment shaping some of your research objectives? Like, tell me how you started out when you switched back into the research world.
Yeah, so I switched crops. So here I work mostly on tomato, and I do some work in eggplant as well. My lab maybe does like 75% tomato breeding and genetics and like 25% eggplant. I'm here at Cornell University, so based in upstate New York. What we focus on in tomato breeding is variety development for the Northeast, right? I mean, as you can imagine, based on where we're located. Why I think that's important is because we have a lot of tomato production in New York. We have somewhere around like 2,000 acres that probably represents hundreds or maybe even over 1,000 farms, right? Because we have many smaller, diversified vegetable farms. For many of these people, tomato might be an important crop for them in terms of, revenue coming into their farm. But in Florida, for example, they have something more along the lines of like 20,000 acres of tomato, right? There's also lots of tomato growing in high-tech greenhouses. In California, there's a couple 100,000 of acres of processing tomato that they turn into, ketchup and tomato sauce, etc. We're not necessarily an area that the private sector, the private seed sector, really focuses on in terms of variety development and addressing the needs that there are in this area. So that's what I really consider, an important part of my job as a public sector scientist, is to try to focus on issues, problems, diseases, for example, that can be a big challenge in the Northeast and maybe aren't a major focus in private sector breeding efforts.
Let's just pick one of the major differences that you're pulling out that are important to New York production. Any particular diseases that you're breeding for resistance? You're breeding for resistance?
That's right. Yeah. So there's, if you've grown tomatoes, like you've probably noticed that they can be quite prone to disease. There's many diseases that can be problematic. Generally in New York and this area, especially in terms of outdoor growing, fungal and bacterial diseases are some of the main challenges. In terms of fungal diseases, late blight is one that people, often can be concerned by because it's a disease that we don't always have. It's a disease that doesn't like overwinter in the soils here. It blows in from somewhere else every year. It doesn't always come in, but when it does, it can be really devastating, especially for organic growers who have limited means to control it. There's some other fungal diseases like early blight, septoria leaf spot that can be very damaging, and these are diseases that do persist in the soil. So they can build up and become problems in certain fields. There's some bacterial diseases that are the same way: bacterial speck, bacterial spot, bacterial canker. Those can also cause a lot of problems. In our germplasm, so in our breeding material, the set of like lines and seed that we use in breeding, we have resistance to almost all of these diseases. Not necessarily like complete resistance, but some amount of resistance that we can select for. And that's from a whole legacy of breeders before me. So before I started my position, there was another tomato breeder. Her name was Martha Mutchler. She worked at Cornell for, I think, around 40 years. She made a lot of progress in terms of breeding for resistance to many of these diseases, so we're continuing some of that work. And then many other breeders and geneticists around the world and here and other places have also found resistance to these diseases that has been moved into the material that we use in our breeding program.
Yeah. So from a, I don't 30,000 foot view, what should I know about tomato genetics, like the species, where are they coming from, like that genetic stock that you're talking about? What are you looking for in there?
So the tomato, the scientific name is Solanum lycopersicum. Tomato, the wild ancestor of tomato, is native to South America, the kind of like western South America between the Andes Mountains and the coast, and various other species that are related to tomatoes still grow in the wild there. Plant breeders actually like use genetic variation from those wild species to improve the crop that we now grow as tomato. In terms of like disease resistance, for example, when plant breeders try to find a gene for disease resistance, typically, in the case of tomato at least, that gene might not be present in tomato itself. When tomato was domesticated, there was like a genetic bottleneck, and only a small amount of the genetic variation in its wild ancestors ended up in that like domesticated crop that we grow and eat today. However, if you go to the wild relatives and inoculate those with the disease and look at those, oftentimes you'll find disease resistance in those wild relatives. And then plant breeders will cross the wild relative to tomato, and through just conventional crossing and selection, try to move that disease resistance into tomato. And nowadays, when you open up a seed catalog and look at a variety and it says it's resistant to diseases A through E, those are all genes that someone crossed from a wild relative of tomato at some point.
So interesting. When you talk about that bottleneck that happened during domestication, about when did that happen, and who was doing that? Where were they? Because I know I've heard some stories about people having to convince consumers that tomatoes were not poisonous, and that was part of domestication. What can you tell me about that?
So tomato was domesticated between both South America and Mesoamerica, what's now Mexico. The immediate wild ancestor of tomato produces fruit that are maybe like a pea in size. People in South America probably selected a form that maybe looked more like a cherry tomato, slightly larger than a pea. That moved to Mexico, Mesoamerica, and people there then selected the large fruited tomato that we're most familiar with today. And that was probably around 7,000 years ago. The native people of Mexico grew and ate tomato and selected various types. You can look at like paintings and pictures that the Europeans drew after the conquest of the Americas, and you can see that there are smooth tomatoes, ribbed tomatoes, yellow tomatoes, red tomatoes. People were probably already growing a variety of different types back then. But then after the tomato was taken to Europe and became part of the cuisine of various different cultures in Europe, then it really kind of like radiated and people selected all sorts of different types. But you're right though, like that anecdote that you mentioned, that at first people thought it was poisonous. There probably was some of that too, right? Because tomato is a solanaceous plant. It's related to poisonous nightshades. I think at first people, it's probably just grown in like botanical gardens before eventually it made its way into the cuisine of these different local cultures there.
Yeah, like I was imagining deadly nightshade just because I have such a one-track mind. I'm always thinking about insects that have developed a tolerance to it. One of my podcast co-hosts was asking about hornworm, and I was
Mm.
like, oh yeah, hornworm, like they're really good at detoxifying those, for lack of a better term, nicotine compounds, like so much so that they can retoxify and then kind of fart out that gas as a chemical
Okay.
defense. We knew that that was a chemical defense for the worm because spiders were more likely to eat hornworms that had been fed a tomato that had fewer of those chemical components. And she was like, "Oh, well, can we breed a tomato that doesn't have them?" And I was like, "Well, then the tomato wouldn't be able to defend itself against other things, right? So
Right.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
that transfer into like bigger, sweeter fruit,
Hmm.
it seems like the leaves kept their complements
Hmm.
of those. I mean, is that true, or did the leaves also get a little bit friendlier, or did they keep their defense mechanisms over that history that you just told me?
That's an interesting question. I comparing tomato to its like immediate wild ancestor, which is called Solanum pimpinellifolium, and that's that species I mentioned that produces like pea-sized fruit. I don't know, to be honest, how different they are in terms of their like chemical defense mechanisms in the leaves, but there are other, more distantly related wild relatives of tomato that do have much, increased like insect resistance.
Hmm.
Um, Actually, my predecessor in this position, Dr. Muchler, she spent a lot of her career actually breeding for insect resistance using a wild species called Solanum pinelii, which grows in the wild in Peru. And Solanum pinelii produces compounds that are called acyl sugars that are secreted by trichomes in the leaves. And these are like really sticky compounds that act as a deterrent. Insects really don't like them when they land on the leaves and are confronted with this chemical. So she actually was able, through a very very complex crossing and selection procedure that took many years to move that acyl sugar trait into domesticated tomato.
I mean, selfishly, I am familiar with her work because it's very rare to have a breeding program that focuses on insect resistance. So us entomologists know about them. Like, ooh. But probably more important is those. Maybe it's more important to say that those diseases that don't necessarily have fungicide opportunities, like would you say like the because you like tell because I know that you work with Phytophthora. Like what other diseases are you working with right now? Or is there a possibility to look for resistance for diseases that's more broad based, isn't as specific?
Yeah, um, oftentimes disease resistance in plants, especially like strong disease resistance, is very specific. That's the way the plant immune system works, right? Like there are individual genes in plants that produce individual proteins, and then those proteins act as like receptors that recognize very specific proteins produced by a very specific pathogen and then confer resistance to that one particular pathogen. In many cases, it's not even like all strains of that pathogen, it's only one strain of that pathogen. Those are situations in which you end up with like different races of a disease, right? You might see that in a seed catalog too, where it says like, this variety is resistant to Fusarium wilt races 1 and 2, but not race 3. That's because they have these different proteins that are only recognized by certain resistance genes that are present in certain plants. I don't really know that much about insect resistance. I am very familiar with the work that Martha did. And that's a trait that's much more genetically complex, right? It's controlled by many genes, and it is this more like broad spectrum resistance that is effective against many different species of insect. And it would be much more challenging for the insect to like evolve resistance to this mechanism. But it makes the breeding much more complex because you have multiple genes you need to move in from the wild species. So, trade-offs, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if late blight is something you want to talk about, but I'm thinking about, I think a lot of people are familiar with late blight because it's been so devastating. Is the pathogen that causes that in tomato the same as the one for potato or eggplant? Is that one of those ones that's like super, super specific?
Late blight, which is caused by Phytophthora infestans. I said fungus earlier. It's not a fungus. It's an oomycete, which are called water molds. Like they look like fungi when you like culture them in a petri dish, but it's like a whole nother kingdom basically. But yes, that species causes late blight of both potato and tomato. There are different strains of late blight. Some of them might be more aggressive on tomato or more aggressive on potato. Usually, in a given year, in a given region, you only see one strain, right? Because this is a disease that the spores blow in the wind. And you'll get a single strain kind of like taking over a large area in a given year. That's kind of like the monitoring that you mentioned. Um, Late blight, has a very long history of being devastating, right? One very famous thing about late blight is it caused the Irish potato famine, right? Which had huge consequences for society. More recently, in 2009, there was a really big late blight epidemic in the northeast U.S. that caused a lot of damage in tomato, and it was very devastating for many farmers. Actually, for me, it was kind of an important part of my career, like uh, story, I guess you could say, because I was working on an organic vegetable farm after I graduated high school in that year in 2009, and late blight wiped out the entire tomato crop, and it was a really big deal for the farm. I don't know if that set me off to then go become a tomato breeder, but seeing that happen and the real life consequences of this really, I guess, stuck with me.
Yeah. If you were gonna play like Monday morning quarterback on that season, what would they have done if they had an early warning? Would that be something they could use fungicides for? Is that something that maybe changed their attitude about what varieties they were using in the future, or was this kind of like a one-off situation?
So so a few things in terms of fungicides. If you're a conventional grower, there are pretty effective fungicides that you can use, especially if you're using them proactively, right? If they're being applied before late blight even comes and starts causing disease. Um, with calendar-based spray programs, late blight can or recently has shown a tendency to be effectively controlled conventionally through chemical control. If you're an organic grower, the options are much more limited. It's much more difficult to control it chemically. There's only very few options, and they're really not nearly as effective. There is genetic resistance. So in tomato, there is late blight resistance, and it works pretty well. When I gave you that story about 2009, at that time, there were not many late blight resistant varieties on the market. Now there are many more. So there are many more options for farmers today to choose in terms of late blight resistant tomato varieties.
Are there other big interests that you have right now when you're thinking about characteristics that you're breeding for your unique market?
Yeah, there's a lot of things, almost too many things that makes our job kind of tough. But quality traits are really important, right? Especially in our area where a lot of farmers are maybe selling directly to consumers, through things like farmers markets or CSAs, or they're selling wholesale, but still the quality and the flavor of their produce, really matters to their customer. Those traits are very important. The tomato has to taste good at the end of the day, right? How it looks is important, the appearance, the size, the shape, the color. One area that we work in that for me is a lot of fun, improved heirloom type tomatoes. A lot of people are familiar with heirloom tomato varieties, right? These varieties are very delicious. Many of them look beautiful. However, they're tough to grow commercially, at a more commercial scale. They tend to crack very easily. They tend to show other defects. They don't store well. They're susceptible to just about all the diseases. So one thing that some plant breeders are doing nowadays is developing varieties that some seed catalogs are calling high looms, which is like a mixture of the word hybrid and heirloom.
Of a
So
portmanteau.
there you go. Yeah. And the idea is just to get the best traits from both worlds, right? The flavor and the beauty of an heirloom variety, but the cracking resistance and the disease resistance of a modern hybrid. And it's tough. It's tough to get all of that together in one variety, but there are really good varieties that people have developed that are on the market today, and we're trying to develop our own as well. And it's a lot of fun to select for these because there's so much interesting variation that we get when we cross modern varieties with heirloom varieties.
And how's it going? On the the promise of high looms. Are you seeing a lot of success of getting the best of both worlds, or like how successful is this approach, especially for tomato?
I think people have been quite successful. We've done variety trials the past couple of years where we grow these varieties and we include the heirloom varieties as checks, like as references. And so, just like as an example, one of the things that we measure on these varieties is the proportion of the fruit that's marketable. So, the proportion of the fruit that is free of cracking, free of cat facing, which is like a defect on the blossom side of the fruit, free of yellow shoulders, all sorts of various things that make the fruit, you wouldn't want to sell it in a market. We see that the heirloom varieties that we include in these trials on average have somewhere around like maybe 20% marketable fruit. So 4 out of 5 of the fruit, you wouldn't call like grade one
Yeah.
marketable fruit. Whereas the Highland varieties, they range. Not all of them are amazing, but some of them get up to like 70 or 80%. So that's a pretty big difference. We've also done like taste testing, nothing formal, but like we have people, come look at the varieties for field days, and we slice them up and have people taste them and give them ratings. The heirlooms usually do place pretty high,
Mm.
relatively in the taste test, but there's always a few heirlooms that are right up there with them or even higher. So there are really good varieties that are coming out nowadays.
That's so, man, it's so funny that tomato is just one of those things that's such a broad, I don't even know where to start. Right? I think a lot of people have their own personal experience growing tomato, or
Exactly.
they have a really interesting value system. People who are like, I'm going to go out and spend a lot of money on a really good experience. So
Yeah.
that's what it's so interesting to think about how different you're breeding versus like the folks who are breeding for Florida, where like you're harvesting at breaker stage. There's like
Right.
swimming pool sized trucks of
Right.
tomatoes driving around.
Right.
So what's that like? Like in your breeding world, are people jealous of you?
It's an interesting question because tomato is a crop like that where, yes, like you said, many people have their own personal relationship with tomato or interest or passion. And that covers everything from people who, they're very excited to put, a few plants in their garden every year to people who, as hobbyists, breed tomatoes themselves and develop really interesting varieties. There are many non-professional tomato breeders who are doing really interesting things in tomato breeding. There's tons of forums online where you can read about the backyard breeding projects that people have in tomato, and I mean, people are doing really ambitious things. They're crossing with like, you can find forums where people are crossing with wild relatives in their backyard. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things. It's a fun crop to work on. It's also daunting because there's been so much that's been researched, so much knowledge that's in the heads of a lot of people out there, so much scientific literature. There's also a ton to learn as well.
All right, well, I'm going to leave it there for now. You're going to hear more from Greg, but I want to hear from you too. What would you like to know more about? Do you want to know more about the varieties that are resistant to some of the diseases that you're seeing in your farm or garden? Do you want to know more about those different strains, like making sense of what your seed catalog means when it says it's resistant to this strain or not that strain? Is that interesting? Or what else do you want to know more about? Leave a comment, and thanks for listening.